The Bible Treasury. A monthly magazine of papers on scriptural subjects. Article 9, Volume 2, 2nd edition, March 1860. First edition, May, 03 1860 070. 7. Moses. Discipline Part 1. J.B. Stoney. Moses being in a special sense the type of him who is the servant of all, we should be prepared to find in his history the most peculiar discipline, in order to suppress his nature, and make room for the expression of that grace and service, which was exemplified in perfection in the Lord Jesus Christ. Born at the period when Pharaoh's interdict against the male children of Israel is raging, no exception is made in favor of him. He enters on the earth to find that earthly place is denied him. There was no room for the Lord of glory in the inn, and Egypt's king enacts that his type, Moses, should die the moment he is born. By faith only his parents rescued him. They saw he was a goodly child, and were not afraid of the king's commandment. They knew by the deep and peculiar conviction which the Holy Ghost effects, that God was to be trusted for this child. Faith in God thus bears him into life. How must he in riper years have derived strength from this godly acting of his parents, and have been indebted to them for this their first training him in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. The commencement of our course gives a color to the whole of it, and the earliest tuition we receive in the divine school gives a mold and a tone to our characters, which after years can never obliterate. Moses' first breath on earth was secured to him only through the faith of his parents. He was hid 3 months. Sorely must their faiths have been exercised during these 90 days, but they endured. And then, in the ark of bulrushes, they consign him to the waters. All place on earth being denied him, the older he grew, the more difficult it became to screen him from the ruthless edict. When we act in faith, and have endured sufficiently so as to establish our souls in the assurance that it is faith, then the Spirit which gives us the faith gives us also wisdom how to act. In this wisdom the parents of Moses now act. Faith is no hindrance to their affections, but it loves to sustain those affections, which, acting alone, would be too anxious and distracted. It supports the heart in quiet, unfailing persistence of the conviction and purpose which it inculcates. From his perilous position in the ark of bulrushes, Moses, the weeping babe, is taken by no less a person than the daughter of him who would have been its destroyer, but not before the impression of the coldness and desolation of this world had been made upon his tender spirit. We read, "The babe wept." Thus, in earliest age, before the mind could be intelligently impressed, is he made to taste of that sorrow and pressure to which he must be no stranger throughout his course. The mind of the babe could not recall it, but the soul, nevertheless, consciously entered on that line in which it was afterwards to be so exercised, and his tears were no doubt the first fruits of a sorrow with which, in after life, he was so deeply conversant. But the answer to this is the Lord's tender care and consideration for him, and this we see exemplified in the most touching and interesting way. Not only is the daughter of his enemy made the instrument of his deliverance, but he is consigned to the care of his own mother and then installed in Pharaoh's house in ease and honor. The desolation of the world and the unfailing compassions of God are the first lessons of discipline traced on his unconscious mind, and which are never to be erased, for God teaches early, decidedly, and enduringly. The interval which intervenes between this first notice and the next, when Moses is full 40 years, is briefly but significantly summed up as the time during which he was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and was mighty in word and in deed. He was introduced into all the attractions of Egypt, that in relinquishing them, he might have sympathy with any extent of surrender which the people of God might be called to. Many might have much to surrender, but not so much as he had and did. If the people felt it hard to relinquish the leeks and the onions, how much more should Moses, who had moved in all the luxuries and honors of Pharaoh's court? In God's discipline and education he was being prepared for the leadership he was to be invested with by and by. The great magnitude of his own surrender qualified him to ask others to follow him. The renunciation of all Egypt's attractions entitled him to take the lead out of Egypt, for if he chose rather to suffer affliction with the people of God, than to enjoy the pleasures of sin, he did so, after having participated in their greatest magnificence. And more than this, by this education, He was made conversant with everything that was delectable in nature, and had experiences of what nature could yield, in a way which none of the previous characters which we have been considering could have known. Neither Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, or even Joseph, had such a training as this, and justly so, for none of them was intended for such a mission as Moses, and God's education and discipline with his people is always suitable and preparative to its peculiar end. Solomon tested the vanity of everything on earth, the Lord Jesus at once felt it in his own moral perfection, Moses is surrounded by it to mature age, and then refuses it. And now it comes into his heart to visit his brethren. A right impulse moves him in a right direction, but we are not always morally prepared for the expression of our impulses, even though they be right ones. Our humanity being the vessel through which they must be expressed, it is often unequal to the trials which the impulse may expose us to. But, if the impulse be right, we may rest assured that the vessel will be prepared for its expression, sooner or later. It may be postponed, and necessarily so, while a vessel is preparing, but this being done, the right and true desire will be owned and gratified. When Peter first proposed to the Lord to follow him, John 13, the Lord warned him that he could not do so then, and, on the contrary, that he would deny him. But when Peter was fully restored, and had his soul strengthened in the love of Christ, the Lord lets him know that he is to follow him, and that the desire which he once so fearlessly and ignorantly avowed, he should yet distinctly substantiate. Thus with Moses here. He has got the right idea and desire, but he has not learnt from God the right way of sustaining and establishing it. He knows not the trials which beset his path, and, consequently he has no provision to meet them when they occur. His attempt only proves how insufficient are his resources for the work he had entered on, and he has at last to abandon it, and relinquish that on which his heart was set, the inevitable consequence of attempting to carry out a right purpose in our own resources. I think a servant of God is generally acting in his own resources when he engages opponents on a level with himself. He thus aims at the tail instead of the head. Moses now directs his vengeance against an Egyptian, but when he returns in the power of the Lord, it is leveled against Pharaoh, even as Christ, who, in accomplishing eternal deliverance for us, first encountered Satan. Moses fails, as he might be expected, and not only so, but his own life is in jeopardy, and for very personal safety he must fly. Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh, and dwelt in the land of Midian, and sat down by a well. What an accumulation of distressful feelings must have oppressed this zealous servant of God! What anguish to a faithful heart to be thus baffled in its sincere attempts to serve his brethren! May not all his sacrifices and surrender of the glories of Egypt have appeared to him now as useless to others and unprofitable to himself as he sat there, a wanderer and exile, like a blighted, fruitless tree in the desert? But if such were Moses' thoughts, they were not God's. The mission was not forfeited, but only postponed. The vessel was not yet meet for the Master's use. Nature was not sufficiently purged from it. On the other hand, God's time to deliver his people had not come, neither were the people themselves prepared for the deliverance. But one subject is Moses himself, and he, as God's instrument and servant for the work, need 40 years more preparation ere he can be thus used. And already, sitting by the well in the land of Midian, is he under that discipline which will form for the great service designed for him in the counsel of God. Volume 3, 2nd edition, April 1860. First edition, April, 03 1860-060. 40 years of exile are appointed for Moses, but whether those years should be one uninterrupted season of sorrow and gloom, or whether they should be mitigated by sources of solace and cheer, depends on the manner in which the disciplined one receives the discipline. Will he bow himself and accept the will of the Lord? Will he prove himself here a deliverer of the distressed, in principle and heart, as well as for his own people? If he will, he accepts God's discipline, and, therefore, his lot may be less trying and oppressive. The moment subjection is established, discipline becomes effective, and may be relaxed. Though not removed, the scene may be brightened. And thus was it with Moses. He acts the part of a deliverer to the women at the well, who were driven away by the shepherds. Although he has been denied to declare himself as such in a large circle, He does not refuse it in a very insignificant one. He does not brood in listless sorrow over his own reverses, like the fool eating his own flesh, but he submits to his circumstances, and rises above his own feelings, in his interest to serve others. Until I am superior to a trial I must be under it, and, while under it, not free to serve with wholeheartedness, or cheerfulness of spirit, which latter is always the mainspring of service. Nothing proves more the divinity of our mission than ease and readiness to accord it in the most retired and unknown quarters, as well as the most attractive and congenial, and when we fully surrender ourselves to the position the Lord has ordered for us, serving Him therein, He makes the desert land, the place of discipline, to brighten up, and provides rest and solace in that on which we entered in sorrow and desolation of heart. At first Moses' service to those Midianitish women meets no requital, even as Joseph's to the chief butler, but it must not remain so. Reuel, their father, sends for him in virtue of his service to his daughters, provides a home for him, and gives him his daughter Zipporah to wife, and we read, she bare him a son, and he called his name Gershom, for he said, I have been a stranger in a strange land. This name reveals to us the secret sorrow of Moses. Though provided with a home, he still felt himself a stranger in a strange land. Therefore, his son, who linked him to the scene, must bear a name which will perpetuate before him his exiled condition, which no present mercies could exclude. They could not obliterate the deep and earnest purpose of his soul, to deliver his people. Nor should they, for, as we have said before, the purpose was right, yea, divine, but the vessel was denied its expression until further preparation. Paul does not adequately express what he receives and exults in for more than 14 years afterwards, and thus, in prison at Rome, he was peculiarly prepared and fitted for doing so. For 40 years, then, does Moses fulfill his daily toil, perfecting subjection to the will of God. Useful and exemplary in the common duties of life, the qualifications which he demonstrated as a servant were a sure indication of those of a master, for which he was being educated, for none can rule well who have not learned to serve. His occupation was evidently a toilsome one, seeking pasturage for the flock of his father-in-law, Jethro. In the natural routine of it, he leads the flock to the backside of the desert, and comes to the mountain of God, even to Horeb, little thinking, no doubt, that the days of his exile were about to close. The moment had come when God could use him, according to the desire which had induced him so many years previously to attempt the deliverance of his brethren from the yoke of Egypt, and now we have to consider the closing scene of that long period of preparation, which the Lord in his wisdom saw fit to order for his servant, and which he is now about to ensure by the revelation of himself. The angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire, out of the midst of a bush, and he looked, and behold the bush burned with fire, and the bush was not consumed. Moses' attention is arrested. Though occupied with his natural duties, they did not incapacitate him from recognizing the manifestations of the Lord. Nor need they ever. On the contrary, if rightly entered on, they guarantee assiduity to higher duties. The shepherds, watching their flocks by night, are the witnesses, chosen of God, for recording the greatest manifestation ever made to earth. It is one of the greatest proofs of subjection to God, to fulfill our daily toil patiently and perfectly, and yet to have the eye ever ready to observe the ways of God, which I apprehend is the force of that exhortation connected with prayer, watching thereunto with all perseverance, etc. And this is the effect of a single eye, one that has the Lord's glory simply and wholly as its object. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, and when the Lord saw that he turned, when it was evident that he desired to know the meaning of the divine doings, God called to him out of the midst of the bush, and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here am I. The revelation of the Lord here is in grace, in a flame of fire, but consuming nothing, the glory of God coming near to man, and man finding nothing but mercy and loving kindness flowing from it. And yet, it was holy ground, and only unshod worshippers could draw near to it. It was, moreover, an expression of God drawing near to man, and not of man drawing near to God. It was to unfold, that from God's side there was nothing to perpetuate the distance and alienation which existed between man and God. And this was a great and precious and needed lesson for Moses. He must, in his own experience, learn God in his love for his people, and also, how man can be brought nigh to him. Thus the Lord presents himself in a flame of fire in the bush, and reveals his tender feelings and interest for Israel. How grateful must such communications have been to Moses! After the long and dreary interval in which it seemed that God had forgotten his people, he is instructed of the infinite love and interest with which he had regarded them all through, and of his gracious purpose of delivering them. And now, Moses is conscious of his own inability for such a service. He sees that it is not his own feelings that he is to act on and to gratify, but Jehovah's, the one who, though before him in a flame of fire, will consume nothing, and the immensity of whose eternal love and mercy must have contrasted strongly with the impulsive and erring impetuosity with which he demonstrated his own, 40 years before. He is now deeply sensible of his incompetency, and says, "Who am I to go before Pharaoh, and that I should bring forth the children of Israel out of Egypt?" God will reassure, instruct, and prepare him, and we read in the following verses how this is done. He first communicates his intention and purpose to his servant. This must reassure him, not only in the proof of confidence which it evinces, but the soul, entering into the mind of God, is more ready and eager to undertake when the process and issue are before it. But more than this, for the teaching of God is perfect, Moses is taught to feel in himself the power of God, and this is grace and life. The link must be established between his own soul and God before he can fully enter into that between the people and God, and this soul-assuring lesson he is taught in 3 different ways. First, he is made to feel his possession of power, superior to that before which his nature would succumb. His rod having turned into a serpent, the symbolical form of Satan, Moses flees from it, but the Lord causes him to grasp it, and it again becomes the rod of power in his hand. Secondly, he learns that if his hand be leprous God can present it sound again, and, thirdly, he is instructed that the water of the river, the great source of blessing, if poured on the dry land by him should become blood, showing that God had the power of life. In all these 3 points he is taught in order that he might be qualified for the mission entrusted to him, and also feel himself equal to it. Moses still demurs. Though strengthened in soul he is deficient in utterance, but God is gracious and considerate in preparing his servants for the work in small things as well as great. He will relieve whatever embarrasses them. Aaron is provided as a mouthpiece, and all being arranged, he took his wife and his sons and set them upon an ass and returned to the land of Egypt, with the rod of God in his hand. How different from the manner in which he had left it, and how indicative is the contrast of what those 40 years of discipline must have wrought in and for him. Instead of an ignominious flight, fearing for his own life, the result of previous self-confidence and acting for God and independently of God, he now comes, small and weak in his own eyes, but invested with the power of God, in the calm easy dignity of one who feels that his only strength is in dependence on the Lord whose work he is about to enter on. But ere this is entered on fully, there is one more question which must be settled between the Lord and Moses. And this gives us a remarkable instance of the exactitude of God's discipline. Either compromising to the habits of the Midianites, or despairing of ever again associating with his own nation, Moses had neglected to circumcise his son, and now, without repairing his error, which was a great one, considering his wife was a Gentile, he proceeds to enter on the Lord's service as if it were a matter of indifference. But, no, he must learn that nothing will be overlooked in one appointed to so high a post. His responsibilities must be equal to his calling. The Lord seeks to kill him, so inflexible is his holiness, and so strict is he in demanding obedience to his laws from one who fills the post of a servant, more than in any other. His wife repairs the inconsistency, but she does so reproachfully, and returns into her own country, while Moses pursues his way in company with Aaron. What a finishing lesson this was just on the very scene of his long-wished-for service. What an impression it must have made upon his soul, as the long-desired morning, with all its interests, was breaking in upon him. No eminence in service, no amount of knowledge in the deepest things of God, will excuse his overlooking any of God's commandments. Nay, he must feel that, as to him much had been committed, of him much would be required. Implicit obedience to the word must mark the life and ways of the most eminent, and best instructed of servants. And with this, Moses' last lesson in this stage of his history, 1. Moreover, which had been severely instilled into him, he passes on to the field of his labors. Emerging from the solitudes of Midian, he is to stand as God's witness before Pharaoh. Being prepared and made ready in a private school, as it were, he is now to demonstrate in a large and honorable sphere the result of his tuition. We shall here leave him for the present, as the varied activities of his service, fully considered, would lead us beyond the limits of this paper.